these people I'm not sure I know. But they just uncovered the desk recently, actually.
The best uncovered what?
They just found this desk recently. It was
really?
in somebody else's attic or
It's
basement.
a beauty. It's a beauty.
But okay.
When you
Became president of the university. He did it.
I think it didn't last very long.
No, I think it was probably a political move to.
Well, I think he was between jobs. There were these wicked stories here about Eisenhower, as you know. He sent around a memo saying that no memo should be longer than half a page or something. And Jacques Bazin said, you know, his lips get tired, which you know was not only malicious, but it was untrue. You know, Eisenhower was a very brainy guy.
Yeah.
He pretended to be a.
So we're all set. Okay.
Now, how long will this be?
Well, I don't know, an hour or so. Is that right?
An hour?
We'll see. If it's
I don't think I have an hour in me to. I mean,
okay.
I don't know. If anyway, we'll see. We'll see.
If it's 10 minutes, we'll go 10 minutes. Well, maybe we can begin with your first impressions of Mark.
How do you want to do? Do you want to ask me questions, or should I start talking, or what?
Well, you'll do most of the talking, but I just thought I'd start with a
Well,
couple.
you ask me.
Yeah.
Well, are we on now?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right.
Can you recall your first impressions of Mark at Columbia?
Well, I had many early impressions of Mark Van Doren, but long before I came to Columbia. The name Van Doren in New York Literary Society in the 20s and 30s was, you might say, everywhere. The place was full of Van Dorens. Carl Van Doren had taught here. Mark Van Doren taught here, but they were both literary editors. And Carl's first wife, Irita Van Doren, was the editor of the Herald Tribune book review. It was called Herald Tribune Books. And as a young man making a living as a freelance reviewer, I wrote every week for Irita Van Doren. And if you knew one Van Doren, you knew them all, you see. Let's see, Dorothy was on The Nation, Mark was a film critic of The Nation. So they were, you know, the place was full of Van Dorens. So that I knew Mark as a literary person before I came to Columbia and that was 1937, 38. I was here for a very short time, just taking an MA in 37, 38. So I didn't see very much of him, but what I saw at Columbia was mostly Van Doren. And because of the famous class he gave in the long poem. I don't know if it was called The Long Poem or it was called...
narrative poem, I'm not sure.
Narrative poem, but the book he wrote, you know...
The Noble Voice?
The Noble Voice is based upon that. And then, well, I was very taken with him as a teacher. I thought he was tremendous influence. And I always liked his work. I always liked his poetry. I was especially fond of him as a critic. I thought he was himself a very noble voice. Mm-hmm. And he made a lasting impression. I have in one of my books told the story of how at the end of his lectures, the class, Noble Voice, we were so taken with him that we would follow him down to the subway. He lived at Bleecker Street. And we were charmed with the idea because he told us that the house itself had been bought with the royalties from his anthology, an anthology of world poetry. And we followed him because he was so enchanting, the conversation, the interest. He was a terribly nice man, a man of extraordinary charm and the rest of it. And up to the last time I saw him, I forget when he died, what year?
1972.
72. I must have seen him maybe not more than a year or two before he died. I remember he and Dorothy and I had drinks together somewhere in Midtown, and I was struck again, as I always was, by his serenity and the rest of it. His brother Carl Van Doren said in his autobiography, Three Worlds, he said, Mark is the most talented of us all. And everyone who knew Mark knew that was true. I mean, though I had a special debt to Carl Van Doren too. But
because you had mentioned that he was an inspiration for your book on native grounds.
Yes, what happened was Carl Van Doren had no longer been teaching at Columbia for some years. Mark never stopped, apparently. And Carl was a kind of scout, a talent scout for a new publishing firm called Raynor Hitchcock. And he liked my early reviews and thought I had a book in me. And I told him that this was 1937. I was 22 years old, and this was the midst of the Depression. And I said, I need a job. I don't need to write a book. And he said, write the book, and you won't worry about a job. And it turned out to be fairly true. He wasn't the inspiration for the book. He was merely the one who got me in touch with the publisher. And later on, when I wrote the first draft, he looked it over. He didn't think much of it and told me to start again, which I did. And finally, the book came out in 1942. But I owe him a great deal. And I was very pleased in that connection to be asked to write the biography of Carl Van Doren for the Dictionary of American Biography, you see, which was my way of paying a debt. The Van Dorens all had tremendous charm. One was always struck by this. Even the people they married had tremendous charm, sort of imbibed this, you see. And then, too, the Van Dorens were sort of a great American story. I never got tired of hearing Mark explain that they came from a family from a town in Illinois called Hope, you see. Was the family originally a Dutch or something? Is that what it was?
Originally, but they had some of their relatives founded Hope, and they named the town Hope, from what I understand.
Yes.
And very much of a pioneer set of relatives that founded that area. And you're right, he always talked about that, as far as I can remember, about those roots in Illinois. And,
yes, and the fact that both brothers, I understand, went to the University of Illinois and then came to Columbia for their PhDs, and of course the rest is history. In one way or another, Mark had a very special meaning for me as a writer as well as a teacher. Years ago, when people traveled exclusively on trains, didn't take planes, I remember coming somewhere from a lecture in the Middle West and meeting Mark on a train in the Middle West, and he had been giving a lecture somewhere too. And I remember I was struck by the fact that there he was in this train, and he had a pad on his lap, and he was writing, and the rest of it, you see. And I'm not sure about this, but one of the last books he did was a beautiful critical biography of Nathaniel Hawthorne. And he told me that the book came out of the famous salmon-colored old edition of Hawthorne, I think it's 22 volumes, you see, which inspired me to get that edition too, you see. And I've kept it in my house in Connecticut almost as a memorial to Mark himself.
did you, can you compare Carl and Mark as brothers? Do you have a...
They were very different in many ways. Carl, the older one, was somehow more flamboyant. He sort of looked, very dramatic. In those days, literary critics, were very important people, and they all sort of dressed becomingly. I remember Carl Van Doren had a special kind of hairdo, which made him look as if he was about to be very pleasing to any lady who come along, you see. He was tall and extremely good-looking, most of all very dramatic-looking, you see. But he was much more impatient than Mark, much more flamboyant, much more impatient. And then his career was much more erratic, you see, whereas Mark remained here at Columbia and kept on teaching until his retirement. When would that have been?
around 1959, 1960.
Let's see, he was born in 1894, so
he taught here for 40 years.
For 40 years, yes.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly why Carl Van Doren left Columbia when he did. Then he was the headmaster of some school.
Really?
Is that what it was? Really?
Yeah.
And then he sort of switched from literature to American history, and wrote a famous best-selling book on Franklin, as I remember, and books on the American Revolution. But he also had this very solid love of the American past. I remember he used to tell me stories about Franklin, about Lincoln. So he misled me once. There's a famous story about Lincoln sending a letter of condolence to a Mrs. Bixby, Massachusetts, who had lost a great number of sons in the Civil War. I remember Carl saying to me, well, Lincoln didn't write that. His secretary, John Hay, wrote that. So I always took it for granted that people like Carl Van Doren said something, it must be true. But it turned out that Lincoln had written it. And I always suspected he had, because you remember the letter. Lincoln says something like, speaks about his awe, his emotion, before so costly a sacrifice laid on the altar of freedom, you see. That thing. Anyway, I knew John Hay couldn't have written anything as good as that. And then, as I say, Carl was more erratic, and he had a much more tragic life in many ways. There was a great tragedy in the second marriage. At the same time, I was always impressed by Carl because his first wife, Irene, and he were both tremendously good looking. They were really sort of like Scott Fitzgerald and Fitzgerald's wife in the 20s. You know, they had an air about them, you know, which you don't see on people anymore, because people don't dress that way anymore, and they don't have that look of being sexually superior to other people, you know. Everybody's equal now.
You know, it's interesting. I remember reading once that Carl said of Mark, he's apparently frank, but actually impenetrable. That there was some sort of facade that Mark kept that was hard to sometimes actually see through. Did you find that too?
No, I think that's a very shrewd remark about Mark. It was true. He was, I couldn't tell whether he was reserved or timid. He was quite formal and same time very modest. I remember one of the last times I saw him when he was still teaching in Columbia, he said to me, I'm overjoyed I have a secretary to take dictation. I have a lot of letters to write. And the idea of someone like Mark Van Doren having to be overgrateful for someone to take dictation seemed to me rather funny, you see. But of course, over the years, you have to remember that I suppose Mark's biggest disappointment was as a poet. Even though he won the Pulitzer Prize, I believe, and kept on writing, his poetry came to seem rather tame to some of the modernist poets who came along. I remember Robert Lowell, the poet, who was the big whiz-bang figure, you know, in the 60s, speaking slightingly of Mark's poetry. He thought it was too timid. I think part of the problem was, if there was a problem, was that Mark was a fantastic scholar and that he tended to be much more traditional. On the other hand, he had terrific taste. As everybody knows, it was Mark who revived John Dryden in his famous PhD thesis, and what a thesis it was. I mean, I suppose it's one of the most brilliant theses ever written in English literature. And everybody knows that T.S. Eliot in the 20s picked up that book and made a big thing about it because it helped Eliot, who was trying to promote Dryden, to say, here's this great book and the rest of it. It's typical, too, I remember that Carl Van Doren boasted in his autobiography that his PhD thesis, which was on some Victorian figure, I forget who it was, some early poet, I think in the 19th century, he said that the book was being published in London before his committee had even read it here. And that was sort of, I sort of like that, you know. Both the Van Dorens knew what they wanted to do. They were in full command of their subjects, you know. As a teacher of PhDs, I get so tired of people who come in shaking like a leaf and wanting me to tell them what to do, you know, what to suggest. The Van Dorens knew, and of course, let's say it, literature was their life, especially Mark's life.
Did you ever encounter any of Mark's bitterness that he might not have been more well-read as a poet yourself? Did you?
I knew he was disappointed. He once said to me, for example, that he had seen by accident a memo about one of his stories, not his poems, that some magazine, it may have been the New Yorker, had rejected him on. And by accident, he happened to read this letter, which was rather slighting of what Mark wrote. And he said to me, I mustn't let them know that I've seen it, which shows that delicacy of feeling which he had, you see. So he wasn't bitter in that modern sense, you see. I think he just felt that he did what he had to do, he couldn't do any better, and that if people took it and published it, so much the better. If not, he certainly had a great success in his career. I can't think of any career from 1894 to the rest. Now, your grandfather, Mark, was briefly in the American Army, you know, and there's a very charming word picture of him in uniform in Carl Van Doren's autobiography. He describes him hopping up and down, being very nervous. And now, he was born in 1894, so he was only 21 or 22 at that time.
Yeah, I remember hearing when he was younger that he used to stutter a lot, and so I think there was that shyness to him.
Yes, I think it was, you know. You know, part of the effect he had as a teacher, as a lecturer, was the fact that, I won't say he came out of being shy, but came out of being so deeply committed to what he said, but he always spoke in a very quiet, very even voice. And of course he had this incredibly beautiful voice, that famous basso Van Doren, you know, voice, which was very effective in the lecture hall. But it gave you a feeling of great assurance. You felt that some fatherly voice was speaking to you, you know. It was an old-fashioned male voice, you know. It was really quite well.
Did you feel that you had a connection with him because you also came from, maybe not the Middle West, but from a small...
I got from Brooklyn.
From Brooklyn, right.
Which the last report was not in the Middle West.
No, I'm saying since you didn't come, but did you have any sense that you both came from roots that were smaller, like the hinterland?
No, I can't say that. My roots were completely different. My parents were immigrants and all the rest of it. No, what I felt, frankly, was that he had a tremendous feeling for America, which I did. This was the thing, you know, that kind of old-fashioned love of country. It sounds sentimental to speak about this now, and you can't speak about it without being thought of as being a chauvinist or being eager to go to war or something. But this was a cultural feeling about America, which had to do with the frontier, which of course, coming from Illinois, he was closer to that than I from darkest Brooklyn. But the other thing was that the feeling for America had to do with America's past, you see. So that his feeling for Robert Frost, his feeling for poets like that, his own poetry, one of which is about the fact that after De Soto died, his men let wild horses go, and these wild horses led to tremendous number of horses in the and that feeling for the past, which I've always had completely. I told him once that my father, a Russian Jewish immigrant, came to America, that he got a job painting boxcars on Union Pacific Railroad and went west all the way around 1907, and then the stories my father told me when he came back had to do with the early frontier, and Mark was simply delighted with that. But the other thing was, of course, that in that old-fashioned American way, he was completely without prejudice. I mean, we live in a world now in which race and racism and dislike of people for their skins and their names is so marked everywhere in America. You know, New York City now is practically a race war. You know, that Mark's feeling about people, where they came from, was rather beautiful. He, in a very real sense, he didn't think about it, except as part of American folklore. I mean, if I had told him I was a Hottentot, but it was one to take a PhD in English, he would have said, "Tell me more about the Hottentots," you see, instead of, you know, removing himself from that. Now, that was a sort of lovable, absorptive quality which people like Mark Van Doren had, which I must say I don't get very much. To be frank with you, Mark Van Doren for me is very much a legendary figure out of the American past. I don't see people like him nowadays. I just don't. I don't see teachers like that. I don't see people with that passion for literature, that passion for early America. And above all, I don't see people who were such writers, you know, in that sense, you know.
We have to stop.